Mandarin Chinese is spoken by nearly 1 billion native speakers globally, far more than any other language in the world. Yet a mere 100 years ago, this language we know as Mandarin didn't even exist. In a massive country the size of China, with hundreds of regional languages, how did a single language unite them all to become the national standard in the second most populous country in the world? This is the story of Mandarin Chinese. Before we talk about how Mandarin rose to prominence, we must first understand what that term even means. If someone asks you, "Do you speak Chinese?" they are most certainly referring to Mandarin Chinese, also known as Putonghua in mainland China, Guoyu in Taiwan, and Huayu in Malaysia and Singapore. But unlike small European countries where one country speaks one or two primary languages, China is a vast country with many different ethnic groups and hundreds of languages. This is the complexity of China we must first understand before we go further on the topic. There are 3 key points you need to know. First, China has many different ethnic groups, but the Han group is the overwhelming majority. Picture a typical Chinese person, and that person you're imagining is probably Han Chinese. 2. There are 7 or 8 language groups of Chinese and hundreds of variations between them. The Chinese government uses the term fangyan, or regional dialect, to describe these languages, but many linguists consider them separate languages, as most of these dialects are not mutually intelligible. In addition, there are over 100 minority languages belonging to other ethnic groups. 3. Almost all spoken Han Chinese languages in China share the same writing system, Hanzi, or Chinese characters. What's pretty unique about Chinese languages is that there's a bit of a disconnect between the spoken language and the written language. 2 different groups of people who speak different Han Chinese languages can share the same writing system and read the same books. So as you can imagine, governing a country with such a diverse language landscape can be a challenge, and this has been a problem for much of China's history. Not only is it a logistical problem for communication, but it also gets in the way of national identity. Perhaps this is why China is so adamant on calling them dialects of Chinese instead of separate languages. And as the saying goes, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy. So what China needs is a national language, a common language that connects every citizen within her borders, from the western reaches of Xinjiang all the way to the eastern coast, one spoken by every one of her 56 ethnic groups. This is the idea of a national language. The emperors of the past had a similar idea, but due to the lack of modern communication, it was only necessary that government officials speak the same language so that they can communicate in the imperial court and pass on the emperor's decree to their respective regions. This is called court language, guanhua. The earliest example of court language emerged in the Eastern Zhou dynasty, which began around 700 BC. This language was known as ya yan, ya meaning proper. The pronunciation was most likely based off of the speech of the Central Plains region, which was the center of power and influence at the time. When Confucius spread his philosophies all over China, he taught his disciples using ya yan, since it was the common language that scholars from every part of China would understand. During the Qin dynasty in 220 BC, the first emperor of China reformed the Chinese writing system and standardized Chinese characters across the empire. This will be important later on, so we'll get back to it. In the Han dynasty that followed, a book with a really long name was published that recorded differences in regional languages. Commonly known simply as fangyan, this book often alluded to the existence of tongyu or fanyu, literally meaning common language. These records indicate that there were in fact universal languages that people used to communicate across different regions. The most well-known versions of guanhua appeared in the Ming dynasty and would extend all the way until the end of the Qing dynasty. This was the official language of the court, although it was enforced to varying degrees. At one point in time, zhengyin shuyuan were established that taught proper speech, and people who didn't speak guanhua weren't allowed to take the imperial exam in order to become a government official, although that rule was short-lived. The original term Mandarin was in fact referring to guanhua of this era. When Portuguese missionaries came to China in the 1600s, they referred to the officials they met and the language they spoke as Mandarin, in Portuguese, obviously. So keeping in mind that the original term Mandarin referred to the guanhua of this era, the modern term Mandarin actually refers to Putonghua, the national language of modern China. Even though guanhua is considered a precursor to Putonghua, guanhua itself was not one standard language. It was simply the accepted language of the court. In the early Ming Dynasty, its phonology is thought to be based on the Nanjing dialect of the time, with many southern features. This is because the capital city was in fact Nanjing. When the capital city moved to Beijing in 1421, it would be natural to assume that the Beijing phonology, or Beiyin, northern accent takes over. But there are many who believe that the southern accent, Nanyin, actually dominated all the way until the fall of the Qing dynasty. One evidence for this theory is that most early Western students of Chinese recorded the sounds of the southern dialects. The earliest attempt to Romanize Chinese were created by these Western students, and most of them feature a fifth tone, 入声, which is a characteristic only found in Southern Chinese languages. By the end of the 19th century, the Chinese language was in a weird place. The writing system hadn't changed much since 220 BC when Qin Shi Huang standardized Chinese characters, and not only that, the written language itself was also slow to change. Almost all writing followed the conventions of Wenyan, or literary Chinese. In contrast, the spoken language had grown and diverged. Regional languages had evolved to be different from each other. But most importantly, the spoken language no longer matched the written language. Scholars believe that at one point in time, Wenyan reflected the conventions of spoken Chinese. But in the 19th century, the spoken colloquial, now known as baihua, was far different from literary Chinese. And except for the few elite members of society, most could not read or understand it. In the late Qing dynasty, the strength of Western powers was overwhelming the weakening dynasty. It became clear that China's largely illiterate and undereducated population could not compete with the rest of the world, and the flames of language reform began to ignite once again. In 1902, a scholar named Wu Ruluan returned from Japan after spending some time there to study their education system. He believed that China should imitate Japan in adopting the Western model for education, and one key point he made was in regards to a national language. Japan had already seen success with language reform and had their own national language, or kokugo in Japanese. So why shouldn't China? There was just one small problem. China already had a national language, Manchu, the language of the Qing rulers. But not to worry. At this point, the Manchu language had already been slowly dying out for some time, and the dynasty was too weak to say otherwise. So when someone suggested that guanhua be officially renamed Guoyu, the dynasty said, okay. The following year, they even commissioned a project to establish a standard pronunciation for the national language. But with the collapse of the Qing dynasty shortly afterwards, the pursuit of a national language would fall on the hands of the new Republic of China. In 1913, the Commission on the Unification of Pronunciation convened for the first time. And if you watch my video on the history of Pinyin, you might remember that this was the year Zhuyin was created, which was the phonetic system that came before Pinyin. What I didn't mention previously was the underlying motivation for creating a phonetic system in the first place. No, it was not to help you learn Chinese, and it wasn't even to help improve the literacy rate. The real reason they wanted to create a phonetic system was to establish a standard pronunciation for Chinese. That's why Zhuyin was created. Unfortunately, the effort to create a standard pronunciation would not go so smoothly. The conference quickly became divided between two factions, two different ideas on what the national language should look like. On one side were the advocates for guoyin, or national pronunciation. These people believed that the national language should be based on the Beijing phonology, but include features of other dialects, especially the southern dialects. On the other side were advocates for jingyin, the Beijing pronunciation. Their proposal was much simpler. Make the Beijing accent the national standard, period. Now obviously there's no video footage from 1913, but multiple sources tell me that the fighting was indeed intense.
Oh, I want to see you do that. Goddammit, come on. You don't know who you're messing with, man.
But let's look at their arguments from a rational point of view. The argument for the Beijing pronunciation was quite simple. Beijing was the center of power at the time, and being in the north, it meant that there were many other dialects that sounded similar to the Beijing accent. This characteristic was naturally formed because of geography. See, the northern parts of China consist of large open plains where language and people can freely travel over long distances. Therefore, the northern dialects are more similar sounding to each other than the southern dialects. By contrast, the southern regions of China consist of hilly jungles. The rough terrain makes travel more difficult, and people who live there tend to stay within their own villages. It's common knowledge in China that even if you go across the mountain to the next village over, you might not understand their speech. But this kind of isolation is not without its benefits. Traditionalists would say that the southern dialects of Chinese have better preserved the sounds of ancient Chinese. While the north was largely influenced by the Manchurians, who ruled during the Qing dynasty, the south was somewhat sheltered from their influence. This is largely the reason why so many people advocated for the national pronunciation and keeping the southern phonology. They argue that the southern dialects of Chinese are more true to classical Chinese, and even the rhyme and rhythm of ancient poetry can only be truly appreciated when read in southern Chinese languages. In the end, their efforts won out the battle, and Guoyin was set to be the national standard of China. It would be based on the Beijing phonology, but include southern characteristics such as the following. It would have 5 tones: Yinping, Yangping, Shangsheng, Qusheng, and Rusheng. The first 4 tones correspond to the 4 tones of modern Mandarin, while the 5th tone only exists in southern Chinese dialects. It would also preserve Jiantuan Yin. Without going into too much detail, in northern dialects, these 3 pairs of words sound the same to each other, but they sound different to each other in southern dialects. So in addition to Jian, Qian, and Xian, the southern dialects also have these sounds, Zian, Tian, and Xian. But there was a big problem with Guoyin. Nobody actually spoke this language. This first attempt at creating a national language became a Frankenstein experiment that resulted in a hybrid language that nobody actually spoke, which meant that everybody would have to relearn how to speak in order to become fluent in this national language. The government tried their best to teach people this new language with the aid of Zhuyin, which was supposed to help with pronunciation. In 1921, they asked linguist Zhao Yuanzhen to record the proper pronunciation of 6,500 Chinese characters on the latest technology of the time, the gramophone. This was actually their second attempt at recording this project, since the first guy they found couldn't quite pronounce all the words properly. Luckily, this time they found a professional. Zhao Yuanzhen was quite accomplished in his field. He studied in the US for a while, and Harvard still has a page on him. And Mandarin learners might have heard of the shi 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 poem.
Shi 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 shi. Shi 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 shi.
Yep, that's him too. So this massive project, which was recorded in Columbia Records in New York, did it help in spreading the national language? Well, in Zhao Yuanzhen's own words, for 13 years, I was the sole speaker of this idiolect, meant to be the national language of 4, 5, 600 million speakers. So no, it was a horrible failure, and in 1924, this fake language was abandoned for a new national language that would be based solely on the Beijing phonology. The pre-1924 national language would become known as Lao Guoyin, Old National Pronunciation, while the new version would become known as Xin Guoyin, New National Pronunciation. This new standard would be officially publicized in 1932. In the following years, the Republic of China would continue to take small steps in promoting the national language, increasing its use and publishing educational materials to help students learn the language. But as you'll soon see, converting an entire nation to one single language is tremendously slow and difficult work. And following the Japanese invasion in 1937, a period of war and turmoil would fall over China. The next stages of language reform would have to wait until much later, under the leadership of a new ruling government. The Communist Party of China was largely in agreement with the Nationalist Party when it came to language reform, but political differences meant that neither side wanted to align themselves with the other side. This meant that when the Nationalist Party fled to Taiwan, they abandoned the simplification of Chinese characters, a movement their own party had started. On the flip side, the Communist Party in mainland China largely adopted the national language that was created by the Nationalist Party, but simply renamed it Putonghua. Now, the first 2 characters in Putonghua is not the common Chinese word putong, meaning common or ordinary. Instead, it carries the meaning of 普遍 plus 共通, meaning widespread and mutually understandable. It reflects the same intentions as national language, a common language that's used and understood all over the country. In 1955, two national conferences convened that would solidify the direction of the Chinese language reforms. For decades now, the Chinese people have been working to reform three facets of their language: creating a phonetic notation for Chinese, simplifying Chinese characters, and forming a national language. All three facets were started by the Republic of China or the late Qing dynasty, but they would be completed by the People's Republic of China. If you missed my videos on the history of pinyin or the simplification of Chinese characters, you can find those videos in the description box down below. This video that you're watching right now is my long overdue video on the final facet of the 1950s language reform, the creation of the national language. The 1955 conferences would dictate that Putonghua have three key features: the phonology of the Beijing accent, the northern dialect as a base dialect, and the common literary vernacular as the basis for grammar. But even though creating these standards may seem like an easy task, the hard work had just begun. The real challenge was getting everyone on board to use this national language. See, to promote a new writing system, all you have to do is control how books and media are published. And in China's case, most of the population was illiterate anyways, so you're basically starting from scratch. But the government has no way of dictating how people speak in everyday life, which made this facet especially challenging. At first, they put an emphasis on finding broadcasters who could speak in standard pronunciation, but all of that went down the drain in the 60s when the Cultural Revolution happened and media personalities were chosen based on their political affiliations instead of their standard pronunciations. It was not until 1978, when Deng Xiaoping takes over, that they were able to refocus on promoting Putonghua. In 1982, the Chinese Constitution was revised with Article 19 reading, "The state promotes the nationwide use of Putonghua." It was a brief statement, but it meant that Putonghua now had the official support of the law. In 1994, the Ministry of Education established a national Putonghua proficiency test applicable to primary and secondary school teachers as well as radio and TV broadcasters. The state had always pushed for proper pronunciations in official broadcast, but it was the first time they placed legal requirements directly on the voices of media. Broadcasters could now be fined for every mispronounced word. The use of dialects in entertainment was discouraged and sometimes outright banned. In 2005, there was even a law that portrayals of Chinese leaders in historical films and dramas would have to speak Putonghua, despite the blow to historical accuracy. Most of them did not speak Putonghua. Under this law, even portrayals of Mao Zedong himself would have to speak Putonghua, when in reality he only ever spoke in Shaoshan dialect. As TV became more and more popular, the media scene in China became a non-stop battle to promote Putonghua, often against the interest of media companies. See, what the media companies discovered was that content produced in local dialects were quite popular. People loved to hear their mother tongue featured on their favorite TV shows, and using local dialects often added humor or cultural undertones to the content they're a part of. There became a clear conflict of interest between what the government wants and what the people want. The government wants Putonghua to be used everywhere in order to promote language unity and patriotism. But the people want to keep their own languages and their distinct culture and identity. As Putonghua began to grow ever more prolific, some people began to wonder if the government secretly wants to erase their own language and culture. 宁卖祖宗田，不忘祖宗言. I'd rather sell my ancestors' land than forget my ancestors' language. This is a Hakka saying and reflects the importance of language to Chinese people. And truthfully, this saying can apply to any people in any place. The geographical location does not dictate a people's culture, but their language certainly does. An erasure of language is an erasure of culture. The Chinese government had always operated in sort of a gray area when it comes to regional languages. They never explicitly declared whether Putonghua should replace regional languages or live alongside of them. I should also clarify that true minority languages, the languages of China's ethnic minorities, receive more protection than Han Chinese languages. So languages like Mongolian or Tibetan are more protected than Shanghainese or Hakka. The second largest language group in China is Cantonese, the language spoken in Guangdong province. And this community is very well aware of their unique cultural identity. From Hong Kong action films to Canto pop and traditional Cantonese opera, Cantonese truly proves that language and culture go hand in hand. So when the government proposed that Cantonese broadcasts be replaced with Mandarin programs in 2010, protests broke out. This debate has been going on for decades in Guangdong, and especially in Hong Kong ever since the UK handover in 1997. Cantonese speakers are startled by the number of their own young people who cannot speak Cantonese. And in Hong Kong, where Mandarin is slowly replacing Cantonese in the classrooms, many educators and parents are worried that they could be next. The language and cultural identity that is so important to them could be eroded away in just one generation. The same phenomenon is happening to all of China's minor languages to varying degrees. It's just that the smaller languages don't get nearly as much attention. Again, there's a conflict of interest. There are many practical benefits to learning Putonghua. It keeps you more connected. It opens the door to more opportunities. Without knowing Putonghua, one cannot even take the Gaokao exam to place into university. But the diversity in languages is part of what gives China such a rich culture, and you can't put a price tag on the value of culture. Mandarin Chinese has come a long way since the 1950s, but it might surprise you just how long and arduous this journey has been. In the year 2000, the Ministry of Education released this figure. Only 53% of the population was fluent in Putonghua. Take that in for a second. Just 24 years ago, nearly half of all the people in China could not speak the national language. When my parents went to school in the 70s and 80s, they tell me that almost no one spoke Putonghua at school. Everybody just spoke in the local Henan dialect. This figure has since improved, and the latest data from 2022 show that the percentage of people who know Mandarin is now 80.72%. But this means that nearly 20% of the population still have trouble using Mandarin Chinese. Using China's current population data at 1.4 billion people, this means that around 270 million people in China can't speak Mandarin. That's roughly the entire population of Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam combined. From this perspective, I can understand why the government wants more people to use Putonghua. But it's also equally important to recognize the rich language culture that China already has. The slow disappearance of China's regional languages matters. For a nation that prides itself on a long and rich history, every dialect, every language carries a part of that culture and tells a part of that story. As a Chinese American who spent a lot of time improving my own Mandarin, I do so because I value my heritage and where I come from. And if you're learning Mandarin Chinese, I hope this video shed a light on the insane history of the very language you're studying. This was the story of Mandarin Chinese. Thank you for watching.